All right, so I believe if I remember correctly, this is actually week 10 for us of studying our senses, and we're getting near the end of it. And many of you are probably like, "Woo! Thank God we're getting near the end of that." But we're gonna definitely, I think, bring our discussion of worship and touch. I think we're gonna bring that to a close today, and we're specifically gonna spend some time looking at worship. Go ahead, Dave.
You continue your sentence until.
No, I'm good. We're pretty much gonna
You
wrap
said
up.
senses, and I had forgotten what we were talking about.
Yeah.
All I could think of was common senses, but you're not going to get there.
No, remember we've been talking about our 5 physical senses and then our 5 spiritual senses.
Which one are we on now?
We actually started. I think we might have started touch and worship last week.
Yep.
And so now we're in a second week of it.
Okay.
And I will say, since Dave wasn't here, I did give him the notes. But one thing that I want to make sure that we clarified, because it really played into this week's teaching, and I had no idea how much of a need there would be. And I'm glad that John prayed that we would have God's hedge of protection around us. I definitely want to pray that God would, keep us from confusion, error, or distraction. Last week we pretty much made the teaching, and hopefully made an agreement together to recognize through our teaching that worship at least was a little bit different than what I previously thought it was. Previously, I thought that worship was really a matter of whether or not I might raise my hands and close my eyes or lay down on the floor prostrate, and that's really all that it was. And while those things are a part of it, our teaching last week really led us, or should have led us, to understand that worship is a matter of everything we do. Every way that we display ourselves, every way that we carry ourselves, what we do in our lives has the potential to be a worship of God. This was the statement that God was working in me for the days that I studied leading up to that, and it was a real revelation. Well, 2 days ago, I sat down and came up with a bunch of ideas and copied and pasted a bunch of scripture into my document, getting ready to work on week 2. And to make a long story short, yesterday when I woke up and started, I basically started by deleting everything that I had, because God had something else in plan. And that something else it is going to be a lot of information. There's 3 pages of information that have all been put together in less than the last 24 hours. And it really was grueling and exhausting for me, because it's a very exhaustive study, but it is one of the best that God has done with me in a long time. And how much came out of this study for me is just phenomenal. I'm hoping that it's not just that way for me. I'm hoping that for you guys, you can really resonate with something here, because what I believe God revealed in the study of one passage of Scripture is really what this is. What God has revealed are the ways in which we worship and the ways in which we don't. That's what I'm literally giving as a teaching, and that's a pretty strong statement to make. Who am I? Bill Taylor, 46 years old, sitting in this little place here, going to make a determination about ways in which we should worship and ways in which we shouldn't. But I believe that not only is it scripturally based, but I believe that you're going to agree, because Yeshua definitely chose this particular passage we're going to look at for a reason. So I want to make sure that we do get through the information. I want to make sure that we understand, because I really, even if we do have to continue into it, because we need to stop for some questions, we will do that. But I feel like all of this information does definitely need to be studied and be looked at in one area, because we're going to look at not only the ways that we do worship, but we're going to look at the ways that we don't, and some of those ways we may identify in our lives as happening regularly. And the conclusion, the 3rd page, is to say, how do we fix it? So all of this, I believe, is revealed in the text, and I just really want to make sure that we at least have an opportunity to study it, let alone perhaps here. If we need to do some of that next week, we will. But basically, we are going to pull out one passage of Scripture from the New Testament that we studied last week that we talked about, and we're going to try and give an answer about why. Now remember, I'm going to share with you, just for sake of room on the page, we're starting at the top of page 17, just for the sake of argument, I took off the scripture so that I could keep everything formatted into 3 pages, because it was almost going into 4. But I'm going to give you the preface of the scripture leading up to this so that you can remember verses 1 through 4 and what's happening. The disciples that are with Yeshua have been seen by the Pharisees as picking grains of wheat and some other things and planning to eat it, and have not washed their hands. And the real point that we made last week was to say, why is it that when the Pharisees start asking him about food and the washing of hands, that his answer to them is to say, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you guys that you're hypocrites, you worship me in vain. So why does he answer them? That was one of the questions we asked, is why does he answer them with an answer of worship and a discussion of worship? Well, God led me to absolutely break this down, find the context of what was going on in Isaiah, and I believe that from the passage in Isaiah, and this is why Yeshua used it, we identify 7 ways to worship and 7 ways not to, all of which revolve around the idea that worship is what we do and how we come to God and how we approach. So I'm going to start at the top. We're going to go through some of this. It says, starting in verse 5, and the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with impure hands? Keep that in mind, this idea of tradition. And he said to them, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. Neglecting the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men. He was also saying to them, you nicely set aside the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. There's a very distinct reason we're going to discover why he spent so much time focusing on those statements with them. And we're going to go and look at the actual passage from Isaiah and what it is he's quoting, because he actually paraphrases it in part. There's more there, and when we look at the breakdown, we're going to discover more. Now, notice in the box I have study sections 1 and study section 2. Study section 2, which is, and the reason I put this together is because this is the entire passage of Isaiah. I'm going to read both sections of it now, but the second half is study section 2, which we don't get to until you get to page 19. Okay, and that is basically the answers of how to fix, where we're at. But I'm going to read through this, all of this stuff for Isaiah together so we can see it all in its context. Isaiah 29, this is where it comes from, Isaiah 29, verses 13 through 16. Then the Lord said, because this people draw near with their words, and honor me with their lip service, but they remove their hearts far from me, and their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote. Therefore, behold, I will once again deal marvelously with this people, wondrously marvelous. And the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the discernment of their discerning men shall be concealed. Woe to those who deeply hide their plans from the Lord, and whose deeds are done in a dark place. And they say, who sees us, or who knows us? You turn things around. Shall the potter be considered as equal with the clay? That what is made should say to its maker, he did not make me? Or what is formed say to him who formed it, he has no understanding. This is the passage we're going to look at. And when I tell you that this was an exhaustive study for me, it really was. I actually even began to develop some physical pains in my neck and my back and some other things for all the time that I spent and how much work I was doing typing and everything else last night. And interestingly, one of the things that I realized in this study is that a real, true, proper worship of God, especially when you're not really accustomed to what it is or what it should look like, is going to bring pain. The worship of God is not intended to bring pain, and certainly not like the way pagan, worship would take place with pagan gods. But when the body desires what the body desires, which is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit desires to worship God, you better expect there's going to be some pain. Because when you decide to give and lean in towards the spirit and worship God, there's going to be pain for the body, especially if the body is used to getting what it wants. And I really had to discipline myself and condition myself to keep moving forward. I kept wanting to stop and go sit on the couch and eat some chips and eat some snacks, watch some TV, do something else. I mean, there was 1,000,001 things that I wanted to go and do with my body, and I conditioned myself and made myself get through each one of those temptations and moments until I was finished and it was time to go sit down and I could do those things. And it felt much better when I did it that way. If I had stopped and gone and sat down on the couch telling myself, oh, don't worry, you'll get up in 10 minutes and go back in there right, we all know I wouldn't have got back up and went in there right. And we all would have suffered from, hopefully, our time of study together, whatever else. I'm very thankful, that this is becoming a real learning lesson and change for me. So right off the bat, what we're going to look at, we're going to talk about is 7 ways we do and we do not worship God. One thing you'll get with me with study, and you guys may have already heard this from different things, is that oftentimes numbers represent different things, and there's different, what we might refer to as spiritual meanings, perhaps between numbers. And the number 7 has always been listed as denoting a number of completeness. Okay, there are, and we'll say that the number 8, just to give some comparison, has always been the number of newness. Okay. So, or new life, so to speak. So 7, how many days are there in a week? 7, right? That completes the week. the 8th day of the week is a new week, right? It's a new day. And there are, 4 has always been listed as the number of witness, so to speak. How many gospel passages are there? 4, right? These are all witnessing of the same thing. You know, there is a lot of different things that can be said, but 7 absolutely is the number of completeness. And the initial menorah that was created to be in the temple has 7 branches. Now, a Hanukkah menorah, if you've ever seen one, has 9 branches, and that's something specifically different for the sake of Hanukkah. But let me ask again, while Mark's bringing some food in for us, let me ask again and see which one of you, or if any of you remember, what is the purpose of the menorah? What is its function?
Light.
Worship.
Light.
Say it again. Say it loud.
Light.
Yes. The purpose,
Say what
it's that simple. The purpose of the menorah is to bring light into the world, right? It's to illuminate a dark place.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I read once in some commentary and some other things that the windows of the temple, the windowsills of the temple, were actually, when they were manufactured, so to speak, they're actually beveled. And they're, I don't know if beveled is the right word I'm looking for, I think there's another word, but basically the window edges are like this. And the expectation is that as the menorah is shining inside as it's supposed to be, the transitioning the windowsills this way gives more light to the world. It puts more light out there. And you'll often find that God has created this teaching tool where there are connections between things, so to speak. So on a menorah, you have a central branch, and you can actually see it here on your page. If I turn it sideways like this, this is what we have here. So the 7 ways that we look at worshiping, you can see that there is a central branch, and then all the other branches pass through that one. And this shows the connection between them. So this teaching and this information is very interwoven. Okay, there's a lot of ways, I feel, just from the text, for us to really recognize what God is teaching us, or what He would intend to teach us about worship. So I've taken what we refer to as the study section 1, and I've broken it down into 7 sections. Okay, it pretty clearly, to me, seemed to be broken down that way. You could take or leave that. If you wanted to choose to break it down a different way, or you wanted to look at it differently, you could. But I really feel, as we go through and study this, that you'll see some connections. And part of the exhaustive work for me on this was looking up in each one of these sections, in most cases, 2 different Hebrew words, and beginning to study and understand what the connection was between them, and really trying to put it together. So the way this page is set up is, you can see that I've broken the first section into 7 sections, and I've put the menorah on it, and then I have 1 through 7 numbered underneath, and that is my commentary. Rather than giving you lines and making you have to write stuff down, I just pretty much typed all the commentary out because there was a lot of information going on. So we're going to kind of go through and look at each one, but at the same time, I want to make sure you guys understand something. This chart that is at the bottom of page 18, I'm going to be referring to that every time we do one. So like when we do number 1, we're going to refer to that and understand that the lesson that's being taught is on both sides. How not to worship God and how to worship God. Okay? So I'm going to be flipping, whether or not you do is up to you, but I'm going to be flipping back and forth between those 2 pages so that we can get to an understanding of where I think this leads us. The first section that we've broken out is God is talking about people drawing near with their words. Now I'm going to tell you right off the bat, the word for drawing near, and the idea of drawing near to God in worship, obviously there's nothing wrong with. And using words to do so, there's nothing wrong with. At one point in the scripture, 2 things we see. One, and we studied this several weeks ago, God talks to us about the sacrificial system and teaches us and shows us that if anyone wants to draw near to Him, He will draw near to them. But here is a way in which you can bring and present a sacrifice and have food fellowship with, yourself, your family, your neighbors, your whatever. And here's the way that gets accomplished. But later in Isaiah, which we're also drawing this passage from Isaiah, later in Isaiah, the prophet says, God doesn't desire the sacrifice of bulls and goats as much as He desires the sacrifice of a heart, so to speak, and for the person to display compassion. Now, the sacrifice without the temple, they also talk about a sacrifice of the lips. In other words, being able to give something to God that isn't considered lip service, which is actually number 2. We're going to get to that. But basically, I just wanted to first pitch the idea to you guys and help you understand that when you first go to approach God, when I first go to approach God for worship and have communication with Him, we can do so in words. That's a great start. But the real in-depth lesson we get from these Hebrew words here is to recognize the importance of how we do it. The reason why is because, starting on section 1 down here, draw near, or nagash, means to approach or to draw near. Interestingly, the word nagash can be spelled exactly the same way but pronounced differently. It can be pronounced as nagas. And nagas, another way of pronouncing the same word, means to be pushy. It's the same word. So whether you approach God and understand when somebody's pushy, certainly in their sales or whatever else, they are approaching you in that way. So how are we approaching God in our desire to worship Him? Are we approaching Him in a pushy manner that has an expectation of Him providing for me something? Or am I approaching in such a desire that I want to draw near? The same word means these two things. And if it wasn't for the study of worship, we might have a hard time figuring out what the connection is between the two. But that is what it is. Because how are we approaching? What is our intention? Approaching God with words is okay as a start, but an attempt to sway Him with pushy insincerities is vainly inappropriate. The first way that we worship God is with sincerity. The way that we do not worship God is with insincerity. And that's the start. That's the first start. That's the way in which we make a decision of who we approach God. We have to do so with sincerity. Insincerity is very easily recognizable, even when a human being approaches us, right? And we are not on the same level of knowledge or understanding or wisdom as God. When a human being approaches us with insincerity, we recognize pretty quickly for the most part, don't we? So we cannot certainly expect a full God in any way, shape, or form, right? He is the holder and the possessor of wisdom. Number 2, the second section I broke out is, they honor me with lip service. The word honor, or kabod, as it is, actually means to be a heavy weight. Okay, it means to be something that's weighty. In other words, the honor that we should give towards God is something that's weighty. The honor that He has, the honor of who He is something that carries weight. When God is in your life and the honor of Him is present because He is enacting a miracle, or He is freeing you from a bondage, or any of these things are happening, you can feel the honor. You can feel what is due, so to speak, to Him as you have your relationship. I don't know if I'm explaining that right. You guys understand what I'm saying? If you had one of those moments where you've been praying, you've needed His presence, you've needed a release from something, and what you begin to feel after that experience is the weight, so to speak, of honor that's due Him. And I don't, that's not meant to be in an offensive way or any way, like God demands it, but it's just something that you feel. The word for lip, interestingly, if we back up 1, it says that the people draw near with their words. And interestingly, the word for words is not the Hebrew word for words. It is the word peh, which just means mouth. So instead of actually using, because remember, the whole context of what Isaiah is saying is negative. So what really is being said there is, instead of really trying to draw near to me with the words that would be created from using the tool I've given them of their mouths, instead of being creative with that tool and loving and sincere, they're just using the tool. And the tool's just there. So here a moment later, when he goes into honoring me with lip service, the word lip, or safa, it also is a word that means to complete or end naturally. How is this connected to the word for lip? Your face, ends naturally, so to speak, near this place as your lips are formed. I mean, it's something that naturally completes or just kind of fits in. We're used to seeing that, so to speak. And so safa means to complete or to end naturally. Our lip service, I feel like I deleted something or I think I changed something. I was intending to change something directly on the sheet, so there's a little typo there. But our lip service in drawing near to God should recognize our own natural weightiness as God has created us to be, and not its other meaning, shafa. So again, just like the other word, the word for lip can be pronounced differently, and shafa means to protrude, stand above, or away from. Now in Hebrew, I didn't put all the words in here because I didn't want to get all the Hebrew text out here and make it any more confusing. But in Hebrew, oftentimes words, certain letters, can be pronounced with a different sound, depending on whether or not there's a certain grammar punctuation around the letter or something else. It can denote a change in the sound. But spelled exactly the same, the word can either mean lip or to complete or end naturally, but the word shapha can actually mean to protrude, stand above, or away from. And think about this for a moment. God is saying that people honor me, but with their lip service. In other words, we have a tendency, this is a statement I put on here, we tend to honor ourselves as though we stand above or away from things, when we should recognize that God is the one who stands away, who stands above. God is the one who is weighty, or whose presence carries weight. And oftentimes in the way we approach him, we will tend to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to. That's really what's going on here. If you flip the page, what are the 2 points that I've made? When we approach God, we approach with sincerity and with humility. With insincerity, we absolutely will approach without humility. When you're approaching God to have this worship experience and this worship relationship, if you really, again, what is the connection between touch and worship? We want to get, and this is a statement that changed for me. I used to only say that the connection is that when you worship God, you get in touch with who he is. But last week, I discovered in my study of that we get in touch with not only who God is, but with who we are too. So the real worship, if you want to come in communication and relationship with God and worship, you also are going to get in touch with who you are. And the first thing we should be recognizing is our level of sincerity and humility, and where we're at. Those are the first 2 approaches that we have to take. The third one, he says, they remove their hearts far from me. And what I have here is, this is a deep lesson which asks a hard question. And here's where I brought your chart in again. If anybody wants or needs a copy of this Hebrew letter chart, I don't know if anybody needs or wants a copy of it. I printed some more today. So, very seldom do I go through trying to teach from this chart. But today and last night in my study, I resolved that we absolutely needed to today because this asks a very important question. And it really is the only way that I could make sense of this third point. All the other points stood out to me pretty clearly when I studied them, but this teaching that God has given me about the Hebrew letters, which has been given to me specifically, a lot of, nobody else uses or sees, and I had been finding myself in the last couple of years intentionally trying to pull away from that, whether it was right or wrong, because I was fearful of what other people might think. Today, I'm very clearly going to teach a perspective of it, because I think it asks and begs a very important question, okay, about the spelling of some words and things we look at. And in this example, I did actually put all of the Hebrew on the page for you, so that you can see the transition in the words and some things that take place. So this particular passage, talking about removing their hearts far from me, the word for remove and the word for far in this passage, it's the same word. And in fact, when this passage of Isaiah is translated, it's only 2 Hebrew words. And basically, what is being said is the removing of the heart to a far distance. That's technically what's being said, and only one word is needed to describe it, because removing and far, it's the same word, it's connected, right? It's connected. But going to number 3, it says, this is a deep lesson which asks a hard question. Here's a question I want to spend a little bit of time thinking and talking about. Which should come first, holiness or discipleship? Which should come first, holiness or discipleship? That's a hard question.
Actually, no. That's not the question.
No?
No. Is the calling to God in Christ first, then comes the holiness.
What is required for the other to do this?
So Carl's point was to say maybe that we back up and talk about a calling, and whether or not there's a calling over our lives towards Christ. And while I respect that and appreciate that, I guess I'm just taking for credit that we wouldn't be studying this if that hadn't already taken place. So my point is, the expectation is that we already have that. So as somebody who understands that God talks about both holiness and discipleship, what role do they play? How do we look at them is really kind of the question. So which comes first? And you'll see why here in a moment that I'm using this play on words to say which comes first, so to speak. Carl does make a good point. We absolutely have to look at ourselves as it already called, right? Coming to that. So we ask this question. Make sure I'm at. Yeah, I asked this question as I flip the page to page 18. Because the 2 words, remove and far, are translated from, and I use the same font that is on the chart. So if you guys are trying to find that letter on your chart, I wanted to make sure that it matched what was on the chart. although this font is considered what's considered like a Torah scroll font. It's not like a modern day font. This is like a calligraphical way of the way they draw the letters. It's still effective. You can still use it if you want to. But I believe, I'm not exactly sure, I didn't really take the time to figure out exactly how the word was pronounced. I believe it's Rukov is how this is pronounced, but it's translated from that word that you see there. And according to the chart, and this is really, you can look at the chart if you want, or you can just go with what I have on the sheet. According to the chart, this study that God's given me years ago, something I've been doing for over a decade now, been pondering, really working to understand this alphabetical structure of the letters, this message of discipleship, and this message of a spiritual walk that I have with God is really just poured out in a one-word description for each letter, so to speak, for me, and that's what's in yellow on your chart. So for me, according to our chart, Cove, and there is a difference when I use the word symbol or illustrates. You'll notice that on the top of your chart there is a column for symbolizes and illustrates, okay? So I just want to make sure that you catch that if you're looking at it. So according to our chart, the letter Cove symbolizes holiness, and the letter Het illustrates discipleship. So I want to, we spend some time, this isn't necessarily set in stone, we can spend some time talking about this. I'll read you the rest of what I have here. It is my belief that a disciple only remains a disciple when they illustrate that their focus places holiness first to maintain their discipleship. That's my statement. Interestingly, I asked you a play on words. Interestingly, I asked you which should come first, holiness or discipleship. If you were to go through this chart, you would say, well, Phil, according to you, alphabetically, the letter Het comes first, and that illustrates discipleship. And then later, you find the letter Kov, which is right here, and it symbolizes holiness. Our intention is to talk about how it illustrates circumcision, but that's its illustration. Circumcision, just so that you understand, is the removal of blockage so that you have the flow of seed. God's word is referred to as seed, and we want the flow of God's seed in our lives, and so we have to remove all blockage. And here's part of the, I guess that is actually part of the connection, that's part of the key. God says, be set apart, and this is what holiness is. God says, be set apart, be holy, because I am set apart, I am holy. Be holy because I am holy. Be set apart because I am set apart. Here's the danger that I realize in this that we face, and it is more pronounced in our worship. If we don't learn to put holiness first as a disciple, yes, we do come to discipleship first because the call has to take place, and we respond to that. And there's a lot of other lessons we learn before we really understand what it means to walk in holiness. But one of the things I always teach about this chart is that the last group of 7 letters, which Kov falls in, that is an everyday and sometimes minute-by-minute experience. Circumcision, the removal of blockage, is sometimes an everyday, minute-by-minute experience. You have to remove the blockage in your life to do what God's prepared for you to do. You have to be prepared to remove the procrastination or whatever blockage is in your life to get you up, get you moving, and do what you need to do. So the key is recognizing that your worship is something that the enemy is after. It's the very first. It's one of the very first things that the enemy deals with in Yeshua in the desert. He goes after his worship. Their experience and their interaction doesn't take very long. The very first thing they talk about is food. I don't know if I told you guys this, but one of the things I found interesting is that almost every time worship is mentioned in the New Testament, you find a discussion of food taking place. Because the worship of God starts when we're sitting down, choosing to be intentional about coming in here, having fellowship together, and choosing to honor God. And put Him first. Put Him first, right? And here's the danger. Your discipleship is what He wants to captivate. And He will do that in your time of worship. If we don't learn to put holiness first and be set apart unto God, we will find ourselves being set apart to something else. We'll find our discipleship starting to get put under someone else. We have a real issue in every type of religion, in every type of Christian denomination or anything. We have a real problem with people wanting to disciple people under them, sometimes consciously and sometimes subconsciously. And we as sheep have a real hard time sometimes recognizing when we just want to be discipled under another person because we like what they're saying, or we like what they're teaching, or we like what they're doing, or we like how big something is growing, whatever the deal is. And we have to be very mindful of that. This is why on our sheet, I have to acknowledge holiness. This is one of the ways in which we worship God, is we recognize, we observe, or we acknowledge holiness. We recognize we have to be set apart unto Him.
Who's holiness?
His God's holy. Well, let's clarify something. The word holy, the word kadosh in Hebrew, does not have the religiosity around it that we put around the word holy. When God says be kadosh because I am kadosh, He is saying be set apart because I am set apart. He is the creator of all things, and He is set apart from all other gods that people might think exist. He is telling us to show ourselves set apart from all the other people that exist on earth because we are His disciples. We follow Him. So I'm not talking about a holier than thou grandiosity of where we act like we are this or that. I'm talking about you do with yourself what God commands to show yourself set apart to Him. When you do that, when you do what God commands about the situation, you show your heart inclining towards Him. When you show yourself doing what somebody else says they think is good, or what you say you think is good, you're just showing your heart set apart and being inclined towards what you think is right, what you think is good. There truly is not one good thing that we can come up with, or that we can choose to do, that God hasn't already established and told us to do. There isn't one good action. So we have to learn, and this is the rest of our teaching will move in that direction very immediately.
So then what you're saying here is, in here, which I know several people which could take this and run off in a far left field with it.
That's where I was mentally going to.
Right. And because, actually what you're saying here is, if a disciple is a follower, right? Then you're saying as long as we follow after God's holiness,
Yes.
or we seek after God's holiness,
So we
then
have
we're a disciple.
So we have to make holiness come first. When holiness comes first, then we allow the holiness of God, the ways in which He designed to be set apart, because He clearly identified work in advance for us to do that sets us apart. And when we do that, we allow that to disciple us. That action of doing those things that He has established is what disciples us. It helps us get smarter, keep our heads in the yoke, and follow Him, because we put His holiness first. If we put discipleship first, then we will find ourselves being set apart to whatever we're chasing after, which isn't going to be of God. We literally have people and churches and teachers and other places that can literally take a perspective, whether they intend to or not, that singles out and it begins to exclude other things that other people might teach or something else, and say, well, follow this because we definitely have this. We have this perspective, this thing here, it's good. Let's make sure we do that. And people will begin to fall underneath that. We have to be students of the Word. We have to be children of the light. We have to learn how to apply what He has said in the Word and learn how to walk in the light, specifically in the light, where everyone can see was what God has established.
So many people say that we've always done it this way.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
They're more interested in following tradition
yes,
than
tradition.
what they are following God.
So what more part of the evidence of this would be to finish this sentence. So,
Well, you have to be careful though, because I know a lot of people who do things that they truly think are from God, and they truly think they have a calling to do them, but if you look at it from an outsider's perspective, you can tell that it's contrary to what God would truly want you to do. So
If
this
it's-
is where I'm
if it's
struggling
truly
with it.
contrary, make sure, because I've had this problem myself, and I've learned God has worked something in me. If it's truly contrary to something His Word says, then you're 100% right. If His Word says one thing and somebody's doing something that's contrary to it, then that's very clear. But if it seems contrary to what we think God would want us to do, but you can't find evidence in His Word that's strong, then just be careful, because God may want them to do it. So just be careful. If it's very contrary to His Word, if He's clearly discerned for you and the Spirit has helped you to see that yes, it's wrong according to what His Word says, then that's clear. That's discernment. That's us using that discernment He's given us. But sometimes God has experiences with people that I have not had. Sometimes God talks to them through visions. Sometimes they have seen Him. They have had interaction. I have not experienced some of those things, so I cannot discount what their experience is, or something maybe He's told them to do, that they believe that. I can't discount that unless I see clearly in His Word that there's a fallacy in that. Then I will perhaps, but you still got to be gentle with people. There you go.
What then is worship?
Worship, we defined last week, worship really has the capacity to be found in everything we do. You getting up and leaving here and where you
That's
go.
what it is, what is it? Try to define what it is, I'd like to hear people's answer, what they think worship is.
Glad I'm all by myself.
Huh? What is worship?
So last week, our group agreed last week, since you missed it, that worship was defined as the intentional, purposeful way we get to know God and Jesus by observing God's laws with love and giving love, and in doing so, we are worshiping Jesus. I wrote it down too, because I wanted to make sure.
That's a good sort of technical definition. What is it in everyday life? Right now.
Well, doesn't that depend on the person?
What is it in everyday
What
life
is-
where Paul said, pray without ceasing?
Yeah, he did, Paul did say that without his.
And so many people do not understand that.
Oh, they
If
don't.
I'm praying, I'm communicating, I'm talking and listening. I'm talking about what's going on in my daily walk
Can I ask you a question there?
and listening for the
Are you,
answer.
are you aware that God is listening to you right now?
I
In
am.
other words, when you were saying that, were you aware then that God was listening? When you talk, are you aware that God is hearing you? You're not talking to you and you. I'm talking to God and you.
The best example I can think of when it comes to worship is from the Fiddler on the Roof.
You're gonna have to speak.
What?
I'm sorry, I said the best example I can think of when it comes to worship is Fiddler on the Roof. As Tevye is walking down the dusty lane with his lame horse, and he's yelling at God. He's saying, "Why are you doing this to me?" He's talking back and forth.
Yeah.
So for me, I like to think that my faith is a Tevye faith, where God and I are talking to each other.
Yeah.
And I also learned that, and I've said this before to many people, that my arms are too short to box with God. That, I mean, I try and get my metaphysical ladder to climb up to the top as far as I can, so I can take a swipe at it. It's like, and go. And so to me, worship is a Tevye faith, where we have a conversation back and forth, and I'm like, ah! He's like, it's okay, man. It's gonna be all right. We'll figure it out. I'll let you know. So there's a conversation back and forth. That's what worship is to me.
And in being constantly aware that he is with you, listening.
Oh, indeed. I may not like his answer, but it's his answer.
All right, well, I want to finish this section and move us forward to the rest of this. We are, I think, making some decent time, but did you have anything else that you wanted to add, or did you have something in mind that you wanted to say, Dave, about what worship is, or?
No, I
Okay,
wanted to get a feeling for you. I have my own. It's similar to his, which is I'm aware he's listening.
all right, let me
Right
read
now, all the time. And it goes along with what he said about praying all the time, which is nothing more than talking to God, saying, "Hi,
Yeah.
Lord, how you doing today?"
And that's a worship, that's a reverence. Yeah, that's a worship, a reverence, and honor. I mean, that's what we talked about in the first two examples. Is, I mean, God immediately talks about people that approach Him, draw near in the wrong way, perhaps, or want to honor Him, but with lip service. So let me finish reading the rest of this section, so we can try and bring this to a close and make sense of it. I'm going to start where it says, "It is my belief that a disciple only remains a disciple when they illustrate that their focus places holiness first, which maintains discipleship." Hebrew, reading right to left, if you were to do that so understand that the word for far and remove in here was the word that was at the top of the page. If we take, Hebrew reads from right to left, so if you take the two middle letters, so to speak, and you reverse the order of them, which is what I'm talking about doing, putting holiness in front of discipleship, then you would actually make another Hebrew word which means to mix particles, mix chemical particles, as in being a perfumer. Okay? And this is a fascinating idea because here's the real lesson for us. I know this sounds very obstinate, but think about this for a moment. When we learn how to put the holiness of God first, and we focus as that, setting ourselves apart unto Him, is how we get discipled. Then we learn how to take the things of the world and mix it into our lives appropriately. That's the key. When we don't learn how to put holiness first, and we mix the things of the world into our lives, we get discipled by that. And we start chasing after that. So this is literally the lesson here. This is what I felt and I saw last night in looking at this. When we learn how to put holiness first, and we allow the holiness of God and choosing to do the things He has prescribed for holiness' sake, when we allow that to disciple us, then we are able to mix ourselves. And I don't mean, when I say with the world, I don't mean worldly things. I'm just talking about the goodness of the world. You can take a cell phone, which is, an invention. God's given us all the tools to create this, and He's given man the intellect to be able to create a cell phone. I can use a cell phone for all kinds of both good and bad purposes. I learn when I put the holiness of God first and I set myself apart to Him, I learn how to mix that into my life and use it for something that's of good, something that's helpful, something that's beneficial. That's what I mean when I say we learn how to mix the things of the world into our lives, because we put something else first. So when we do that, the one letter that we haven't talked about, again, Hebrew reads from right to left, so the one letter we haven't talked about here is the letter Resh. And the letter Resh, it literally illustrates discipline. And when we learn how to mix those things, right, Resh illustrates discipline. And so proper discipline is to place holiness, being set apart unto God first, so that we know who to follow in our discipleship. This keeps our hearts right and smelling attractive, right? Which is what the whole idea of mixing is, mixing particles to make a pleasant aroma. And I use 2 Corinthians 2:14 to help us understand this. But thanks be to God, who always leads us in His triumph in Christ and manifests through us the sweet aroma of the knowledge of Him in every place. This whole teaching I'm trying to give in that one section, I feel like is literally spelled out in that verse that Paul wrote. Because that's why does he use the word aroma? Why is he even talking about that? God is literally, when we come to worship Him and we intend to worship God through the things that we do, God uses us as a vessel who chooses to put holiness first and become a disciple. He uses us as a vessel to give a pleasing, fragrant aroma of who Christ is. Not one that's foul, not one that's inappropriate, because we allow ourselves to be discipled after anything else. So what is...
I was just gonna say one thing, I didn't want you to lose your train of where you was at there, but, the holiness and, coming to God, that's kind of the whole, the worship is when we can come to God, humbly, and ask Him to take over our lives rather than us living our lives on our own. And that's where I was, before I was able to have God in my life, I was trying to do it all on my own. And that's, as Christians, that's what we seek, is for God and let Him be in charge of our lives. And only through humility can we get there. And I asked myself this morning, how can I share this with other people, me as a person, How can I take this and be able to share what God's done for me to bring them to where God can be in charge of their life too, and lead and guide their life and all these beautiful things that come from it. And only through being, honest about who I am and what God is, and humbly going to Him, that is the worship. And then as far as the holiness, I can't be effective for God if I'm not being holy, because the only way I can share God's power and love and way of life is if I overcome the things that God gracefully has taken from me, whatever that is in my life that's to need to change from that selfish person. And now I can, be able to share that through holiness. That is the evidence people see as our witness. When we can be holy, whatever, holy, more God-like. And I can only get there through being humble and sincere about how can I clean my heart up enough to where people can see God through me. How can I overcome these things and give it to God and walk the walk, and it's a tough order, but then God's there for us to guide us. And,
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. I mean, the statements you made is really part of the key here for us is the only way that I can effectively share God's word is to be holy. It's what you said. And the idea of that is that when we do the things of God that show ourselves as set apart and holy unto Him, people ask us what we're doing. They want to know, they recognize that that something is drawing us to be outside of what the norm is, so to speak. And they want to know how, they want to know where, they want to know why, and they inquire about that. Now, the more understanding that they have about God, the easier it is for them to understand, or the more inquisitive they may be. But even people who don't know anything, they still will notice that there's a difference. And this is later when Paul talks about we should be prepared to give an answer. Be prepared to explain to people, answer questions and express. And sometimes what we do, not what we say, but just what we do, showing ourselves set apart to Him, is enough to cause that inquiry that people want to know. How did you get there? What are you doing? Why are you not as attracted to whatever lifestyle that, I knew you that once, you once did, or whatever tempts them? So yeah, I appreciate you sharing.
Attraction rather than promotion.
Yeah.
You said that the key there was the sweet aroma. Well, that goes back to the sense of smell, like we were talking about, which is also the discernment.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're set apart with the sweetest smell from Christ, others can discern that from us. Smell it, see it, or whatever. So it all goes back to the same study we're doing. The perfume is the discernment, the smell.
All right, so let's.
I was like,
Before
I'll
you
tell
go, you keep saying holiness first, and that's a relative term. What do you mean by first? Ahead of what? Ahead of God?
Ahead of where you're,
And
like you.
who are you talking about? Holiness is a characteristic of a being, like God.
It is a characteristic of any being, right? God says, and He challenges us to be holy because He is holy. And again, holy meaning set apart, meaning I have established these things that set me apart from any other gods people would try and worship. Obviously, they don't exist. And God says, be holy because I am holy. In other words, the things He's prepared for us to do, to walk in, the instruction of how to live successfully in this land, is what makes us be set apart. So when we choose to observe that, we become that being that enables or expresses that characteristic of being set apart. When I say put it first, what I mean is, in my immaturity, I ran to be discipled. Very clearly in my immaturity, wanted
So
to be
it's relative
discipled
to being a disciple, you're comparing it.
to being
First is a
discipled.
comparative word.
Because I wanted to be discipled by Christ, but I found myself going underneath each man that God might lead me to learn from, but very carefully had to recognize that they shouldn't be trying to make me a disciple of them, and I shouldn't be trying to make myself a disciple of them. I should be trying to learn what I can to be a disciple of God. And the best way to do that is to not put my mind and focus my mind on, I just want to be a disciple, but focus my mind on, I want to be holy and set apart unto God. I want to make sure that everything I do, think, say, breathe, whatever, is set apart unto Him. And when I do that, that will disciple me. You understand? Putting the emphasis on that. Because if we aren't careful, because the world, things of the world, whether it's phones, computers, time together, meeting places, buildings, whatever, things of the world get mixed into our lives. They get incorporated. And we can very easily choose to run after the wrong things or the wrong direction. Choosing to use everything for a purpose of being set apart unto Him is what keeps us grounded, is what will keep us balanced.
I have an example right here in this room. Two people right here that said, how did you get to the knowledge and wisdom that you have? And I said, I really don't have either one. I only have what God gives me. But I learned it through studying His Word. Now it was an attraction, not a promotion, that got them to say, yeah, I'll go to Bible study with you, okay? And start being a part of that so I can learn too, right? So to me, it's about how I live my life. When people go, I want that life. Not because you have a lot of money, not because you have a lot of stuff, but because you're happy and you're peaceful and you don't let everything upset you and just any little whim. So the difference and what I see happening here is I know a lot of Christians that are full of the Bible, and they can quote it. And for anything you wanna bring up, they got a chapter and verse, but they have no clue how to explain it in a manner that that person can understand it.
And that's part of, honestly, to maybe go back to the question that Dave asked, and I'm gonna kind of change this question. He asked, what is worship? I'm gonna say, what is the purpose of worship? The purpose of worship should be so that we can learn how to have not only an interactive relationship with God, but from that, we mature to a point where we can have an effective, interactive relationship with our community, with the people around us, to be able to give answer that's effective, to be able to share in some level of intimacy with them and express to them what we're doing. And that should be the purpose of our worship. When we approach, he's talking about, he's asked a question at one point, and I can say this for him so he doesn't lose his humility, but at some point he had some humility to say, I may not necessarily have the intellect or the wisdom that you think I do, I only have what God has given me. That was the number 2 way in which we choose to approach God. We either approach with or without humility. That is a worship of Him. We worship God in the way we approach one another as well. The third point that we have on here, just to bring that to an end and get moving on, is to say that one of the ways we worship God is to acknowledge holiness. We have to, with sincerity and approaching with humility, recognize that God has established a holiness, a way to be set apart. And when we do that, we become discipled by Him. One way that we do not worship, the third way that we do not worship, is to make disciples of ourselves. That's the lesson that's learned in these Hebrew words. All of this stuff that we just went over is that point, because we're not setting ourselves apart unto Him, we're trying to set others apart to us, right? Or we disciple ourselves under somebody else. So this is, again, 7 ways to worship, 7 ways not to. Number 4, we need to talk about for a moment, if you look at the page again here, notice that I bolded where it says, reverence from me, tradition learned by rote. This is the central stalk of the menorah. Everything else passes through this. This is the main problem. When Yeshua addresses the Pharisees coming to Him, He jumps directly to the center of the menorah. He doesn't even hardly cover very much of these other points that we're covering or talking about. He goes right to saying to them, but in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men, neglecting the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men. He was also saying, you nicely set aside the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. He jumps straight to the heart of this teaching. This teaching that I believe God's given me, Yeshua's given me in the last day to be able to share today. He is immediately at the heart of it in that New Testament passage. In Hebrew, the word for reverence is the word for fear. It's the word yareh. We've talked about it several times in here, having a proper fear of the Lord. I'm reading number 4 now on page 18. Reverence, or yareh, also meaning fear, also means a constant call to attention or being aware of a presence. That really helps us understand more of what having a proper fear of the Lord should be. A constant call to attention or being aware of a presence. If the word yareh means that, then this begs the following questions. Where do we devote ourselves? What constant call to attention drives us the most? The answer God gives us here is astonishing. He says, to tradition learned by rote. Now many of you, or some of you may want to ask me, what does this mean, learned by rote? What it means in the Hebrew is the word enoshim, which is really just man. That's what it's saying. And what's saying here is meaning the mitzvah or the good deeds taught by men to observe. This is a very serious place, and I think that we see a lot of this on a regular basis. This is the central issue. Is Yeshua against the washing of hands? No. Does he think there's an issue with people having a traditional birthday that they keep or traditional anything that they observe? No. He has no issue with these things. But he absolutely, and God absolutely, through the prophet Isaiah, makes it clear to us that he takes offense and has an issue with us teaching the observance of traditions over the keeping of commandments. That is a problem. We have to discern that our traditions are okay to keep, but the commandments that God has given are our benefit. They are our instruction. They are our way of being successful in the land of salvation into which He's brought us.
They talk about that in Acts. I can't remember the chapter. I think it was Peter had a vision, and he saw God bring down all the unclean animals. He said, "You can eat of this," and he freaked out. So I can't do that anymore. So I think it's what you're talking about.
Yes, in a way that absolutely could be used. I don't know exactly how you're thinking about it, but when a lot of people, as a Messianic believer, when I'm talking about kosher eating or foods or anything else, a lot of people ask me, well, what do you think about Peter's vision? And what do you think should be done in this type of circumstance? And my answer is usually the same. Do what Peter did. Peter, if we look at him as a man who was a disciple and a follower of Christ and somebody who would believe in God and would do what God has instructed him to do, then what is Peter's response to God? God shows him all the unclean meat, all the unclean animals on a sheet, says kill and eat. What does Peter tell him?
No, we can't do that.
And he says 3 times no. So my answer is do what Peter said. Say no, you're not going to do it. God comes down and tests us. He even says, I will bring down manna, back in Exodus, when he brings manna down from heaven, so that I can test them and see if they will keep my instruction and if they will walk in a way. Peter very clearly understood that God was testing him in a way, and he recognized that God had never said that the Gentiles were unclean and that he should not be with them. And he very clearly had an intention to send Peter out to teach and to preach to the Gentiles, and Peter was not aware of that until that vision. And so he clearly understood that he is to do and to keep what God has said in his word and not what a traditional belief was, because the Jews traditionally believed that they should not socialize with Gentiles, that they should not eat, that they should not spend time with them, certainly not out preaching a gospel message to them. In a way, this is really a root of what we're talking about. One of the ways that we worship God, right at the center, the central way, and this is exactly what our teaching was last week, the observance of his mitzvah. The word that's used in this passage, the tradition learned by rote, the word for tradition is the word mitzvah. Mitzvah is describing a commandment. Proverbs says that the Torah is the light that is shined by the lamp. The mitzvah itself is a lamp. The commandment is a lamp. When you activate the lamp by turning it on, the light that it shines is a Torah. That's Proverbs 6:23. Your commandment is a lamp and a light that shines your instruction. So we need to recognize that one of the ways we worship is through the observance of what he's given, the observance of his instruction, his mitzvah. If we have an observance of tradition over commands, if we have those things that are learned by rote, as it says, or learned by men, telling us this is what you observe, if that's what we do, we have an issue right at the core, right at the center. And again, everything passes through that.
So I've actually experienced that. When I was living in Florida, I went to church, and it was actually the last time I ever went into a church until probably about 2 years ago. Because I went into a church and I felt like I needed to be there. So I went in, and that church's tradition was, if you were not a member of that church, you were not allowed to go up and take communion. You were not allowed to go up to the altar and pray. You were not allowed to give a prayer request. You could not do anything but sit there and listen. And I remember thinking, this can't be right. You know, if I have a calling from God to come to this church and to worship with you and to worship God, and they're telling me, well, you're not a member of our church, so you're not allowed to worship with us, but you can sit there. You know, so that's the tradition of men. You know, that they missed the whole point of why they had a church fellowship, why they even had the doors unlocked. You know, like, why did you greet me at the door as a visitor and then say, but you can't do anything, just sit there and shut up. You know, so that's the traditions of man that went awry.
Yeah, we have a tendency to do that all the time. In other words, what we do is we try to put fences around something that we think is holy to God or an instruction or a command that he's given. And fences are not necessarily bad because they do keep you off the grass. They do keep, you know, the animals inside that should stay inside. So fences aren't necessarily bad, but if they keep you from accessing the things of life, which is precisely what God's commandments are, they are the things of life. They are the ways to live successfully into what he's given us. Eternal life in Christ is found through him, and we live successfully in that land by walking the same way as he walked. When we set up fences that keep others out and don't give them access to anything, we have an issue. That's what the Pharisees did regularly. That's what that church was doing, that example. But Christ himself set up fences. I tell you, if you even look lustfully at a woman in your mind, you as well as committed adultery with her. That's a fence. He's putting a fence around the commandment and saying, consider that if you do this, you will have already transgressed it. The fence is good because it enables me to have access, to recognize, to see, but it also, if I employ it correctly and recognize that there's, you know, where the gates are, how to properly use the fence, then I recognize to take those thoughts captive, to dismiss them, to not dwell, to not focus on them.
What I was thinking while you were talking, in that situation too, that, you know, we're self-centered in our nature. And and that self-centeredness, even though we turn to God and to worship and however, that self-nature can come out because we're still fearful because we haven't trusted God in some cases yet. So then that fear comes out to where we try to put those fences up and do those things when really we're motivated by selfishness a lot of times rather than what God's outcome and giving it to God.
I was thinking when she was telling that, did they bring the offering plate past?
Oh, yeah,
and
they
say, don't put an offering in?
No, they wanted an offering. Oh, they wanted an offering.
Right?
One of the signs.
That's a good catch.
Oh, yeah, no, they passed that twice past me.
Then maybe you can
Yeah.
get a chance to take the.
Yeah,
They
so,
might be more tolerant than if you participate.
Yeah.
They
You
say,
can give, but you cannot partake.
yeah, oh, yeah, I remember that was the last time I said, well, if this is what church is, I'm out.
So I'm gonna kind of jump ahead, because I really, we still got a little bit of time, not a whole lot, but I want to make sure that we have an opportunity, to maybe just briefly look at or talk about some of the ways to fix some of this. Because some of my own life, I have definitely found, especially the next one we're gonna look at, I've definitely found some of these areas that for me to worship God more effectively needed to change, and change is literally the next one we're gonna look at. Number 5 deals with the words saying, God says specifically that he will deal marvelously, wondrously marvelous with the people. And that just really captivated me last night as I'm thinking about this and reading it. And interestingly, the word pala, which is the word that's used here, is used to describe marvelously, wondrously, and marvelous. It's the exact same word. And it's used 3 times in the passage. Okay? I will deal with this, in this, and over them with this. Technically, is what grammatically it would look like or appear to say. And the word is used 3 times, and according to the tools that I was using and looking at, it can also have 3 distinct meanings for us to consider. The first meaning really means to diverge from the norm. When you have a miracle, right, in one of the passages, one of the areas where this is used, is talking about splitting of the Red Sea, and other miracles take place. So that's obviously very clearly diverging from the norm. That's change, right? That's moving from the physical to the supernatural, so to speak. So one of the first, and this is why you would have the word marvelously then, right, as a proper way of translating the word. So it means to diverge from the norm, or as I put it, to change. It can also mean freely making a vow, and then it can also mean baffling or incomprehensible. It isn't a miracle sometimes. Here,
It's okay, there's cooler air coming in anyway, so.
all right,
It
just
doesn't
want to make sure
bother
we
me.
can still hear.
It doesn't bother me.
So it can also mean incomprehensible or baffling. Okay? And obviously, a marvelous miracle that God performs can sometimes be baffling to us, right? We cannot necessarily comprehend. So you can kind of see some of the connection between all these things.
So a change can be baffling,
Mhm.
Yes.
as I'm not used to a change, especially in exchanging old ideas that don't work for new ideas that do. And incomprehensible, I cannot comprehend doing that. Okay? And how am I gonna do it? And when's it gonna be done? And this, and that, and expectations upon it can keep it all from happening, when all you really have to do is allow yourself to change and allow God to make those changes. And that falls back into the holiness part.
So I'm going to finish reading what I have on the sheet and go. God deals with us marvelously right where we are, even if it's in an argumentative place, not wanting to change, which is one of the ways in which we do not worship God. The number 5 way that we come to God and worship, or that we worship, is with a willingness to change. One of the 7 ways that we do not is finding change to be too difficult or incomprehensible. We have to be willing to make a change. We have to be willing to change, and more importantly, for the sake of those around us. Not just ourselves, but for the sake of those around us, we have to be willing to change. Okay, this is one of the ways in which we worship God. He deals with us right where we are, whether it is in our willingness to change or our stubborn, stiff-necked difficulty. Notice the bridge that is right in the middle of these 3 definitions. The one that you have right in the middle is freely vowing. In other words, when a person decides to make a free vow, this is what the text says in the Torah. When a person makes the decision to freely vow themselves in a Nazirite vow, God calls that Pala. He calls it marvelous. In other words, you are making a free vow to dedicate yourself to a change in life so that you can serve Him, which is what the sign of a Nazirite vow really is. Taking on that vow is in a way of showing an outward change because you are making a change to serve God, dedicating yourself in that direction. So really what you find here is on the side of too difficult to change, or getting to being able to change and diverging from the norm, comes within the freedom of using your free will. Freely vowing yourself to take self-inventory, to recognize where you're at and make a change. That's how you get there, right? In this, we're even kind of going into the other one. Let me do, I'm just going to kind of breeze through the last two so that we can jump into the last page and just, we don't have to go through all of it. But the last two, you can notice in wisdom, it says, or kokam indicates an absorption or an accumulation of knowledge. Perishes, interestingly, talking about how wisdom of wise men will perish. Perish means to lose a valuable possession. I found that real fascinating, and it can even mean losing the hope of independence. The way that we worship God is to recognize responsibility. That's number 6. If you don't recognize the responsibility that you have over the wisdom God has given you, it will perish. You will lose it like losing a valuable possession. We have a responsibility to do something with it. This is one of the ways in which we worship God. We worship with sincerity, with humility. We acknowledge holiness. We observe His mitzvah. We have a willingness to change. We recognize our responsibility. And number 7, it says that the discerning men, discernment of their discerning men shall be concealed. This is uses wisdom discerningly. The last two go hand in hand. We recognize that we have a responsibility in this world. And part of that responsibility is to use the wisdom that God has given us discerningly. Here's what the last two are on the negative side. We display a lack of responsibility in our approach of God, and we use wisdom selfishly. That is a very dangerous place, and that is exactly what God is talking about in this area. He says discerning or binah means to penetrate to the core, to understand knowledge by way of reasoning, as in the wisdom of heaven. The word concealed, where he says, I will conceal the discernment, the ability to use, the ability to reason. The people that will use it selfishly, he will literally conceal it from them because they will intend to use the wisdom selfishly. That's a bad place. He says, the word concealed, satar, means to hide, to conceal, or most importantly, it means to protect. If you aren't responsibly using the wisdom that God has given you, he will take it back from you and protect it, because he will not risk it being used selfishly. That's really, really on my heart. I believe God looks at things this way. And he often conceals his wisdom from those that intentionally set out to cause harm rather than display his love. And here's a passage where the word satar, meaning to conceal or to hide, is used. Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our sons forever, that we may observe all the words of this law. God has very clearly given us an opportunity to discern, to understand, to have understanding and reasoning, and to be able to use these things. And when we approach him for worship, and we find ourselves in interaction with one another, they can be forms of worship when we approach in these ways. With sincerity, with humility, acknowledging holiness, the observance of what he has written, what he's given, willingness to change, recognizing responsibility, and using wisdom discerningly. In other words, recognizing where to use it and how to use it. Do not cast your pearls before swine. Yeshua is talking about, do not just cast wisdom out in front of anyone if they're potentially going to use it to bring harm or to cause harm. We have to be discerningly careful about where and how and what we share, what we do. Anybody got any questions or anything else about any of that? Or?
I got something, Phil. I just think as you were talking about willingness, I kind of equate that with surrendering to God. And that's kind of where the rubber meets the road for me a lot is then if I surrender, then I'm able to trust that God's will protect me and all the fears that go along that go through my head, that being able to trust the knowledge that comes to me or the wisdom that takes the fear away and then enables me to be able to carry God's will out, whatever that means.
Yeah.
From my life.
Yeah, that's good. We have to be willing to submit. If you were to look at your chart, you would actually recognize that right after you get through this 7 signs of recognizing sonship and relationship with God, and you get through those first 7, the very first step is discipleship, and the next step that takes place immediately afterwards is submission. Because no disciple stays within the yoke if he doesn't learn to submit to the one who's leading him. You absolutely have to choose to keep your head in the yoke. It's an intentional effort that you have to make every day to keep your mind in the book. The yoke, keep your mind in walking with Christ. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. You have to learn to keep your head and your mind inside the yoke. So the last statements that we had for verses 15 and 16, I discovered, I wasn't sure, after I looked at and did all this study and came up with these 7 ways to worship and 7 ways not to worship, I wondered, is God revealing that there are, in those last 2 verses, 7 ways in which you change and that you get outside of the stiff-neckedness that we may have in worshiping the wrong way? And I believe that the answer is yes. That's what this last page is. I'm going to read the verse again. It says, "Woe to those who deeply hide their plans from the Lord, and whose deeds are done in a dark place, and they say, who sees us or who knows us? You turn things around. Shall the potter be considered as equal with the clay? That what is made should say to its maker, he did not make me, or what is formed say to him who formed it, he has no understanding." As you can see, I broke it down into 7 sections, and I've given 7 short statements of commentary around each one. The first one, the word deeply, those who hide deeply, or deeply hide their plans from the Lord. The word deeply, or muck, also means to be profound. Phil likes to think he's profound all the time, right? Now these great statements or commentary that he wants to share. That's a dangerous place that you can be. You have to be careful. The word for plans, or etzah, also means counsel or advice. If that word means counsel or advice, then think about how this statement changes if I say, woe to those who deeply hide their counsel from the Lord. If God has given us counsel about something, be careful not to hide it. Be careful to do something with it. Right off the bat, that's a pretty serious idea to keep in mind. We have a tendency to sound profound when speaking of godly things. Stopping this enables sincerity. We have to approach God with sincerity. We have to stop trying to worry about hiding our plans by sounding like we know what we're talking about. We have to stop trying to hide our plans from the Lord by having an insincerity of thinking that we're profound in something we're sharing, if we're not. And being profound isn't necessarily anything wrong with it, but it could very quickly, I think, lead to inhumility or a lack of humility. The second one, who in darkness perform their works. Choosing to do what God commands us in the light with all our glorious mistakes and brokenness breeds humility. This is literally, the text says, and whose deeds are done in a dark place. But after I read the Hebrew several times, you could literally translate that to say, who in darkness perform their works. Who in darkness perform their works. In other words, we know that God has given us work to do, but we care more about what men think, we care more about what we think, we care more about something else, so we really do it in a dark place. We don't do it out in the open where all of our mistakes and all of our own failings are available because we don't want people to see those things. But when we choose to do what God commands in the light with all of our glorious mistakes and brokenness, it breeds humility. That's how you overcome the second one. If you're approaching God without a lack of humility, then let some of your, and of course don't be too overabundant about this, right? But let your faults hang out. Let people be aware of that. Don't be so fearful of being hurt. In Ephesians 3, 8 through 10, it says, to me, the very least of all the saints. This is Paul doing exactly what I believe we're talking about here. To me, the very least of all the saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unfathomable riches of Christ and to bring to light what is the administration of the mystery for ages have been hidden in God who created all things, in order that the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the church, to the rulers and the authorities in heavenly places. Paul knows very clearly what his mistakes were, and he knows very clearly how many people he killed in the name of God, or what he did, and what his mistakes were. He refers to himself as the chief of sinners, and he recognizes that what he has to do in the light so that the mystery and the message of God can be proclaimed and can be out there for the churches. And he doesn't worry about his brokenness. And where does he do the majority of his preaching from? is jail. He's willing to do it in as much light as what God puts him in, whatever he has to do. Public squares sometimes being beaten and ridiculed for that. I'm certainly not professing that we all run down and the squares are, preaching or getting beat. But my point is that we have to be prepared to do it in the light.
So this is like our testimony, and where it talks about they overcame by the words of their testimony.
Yes.
Right, I changed. That's my testimony, and God helped me change. That's my testimony.
If we go back to number 3, I want to get to this. If we go back to number 3 and we recognize what we put in there, ways to worship and ways not to. Remember, we put to acknowledge God's holiness is the way to worship, and the way not to worship is to make disciples of ourselves. Right? That's a statement we make. Look at what the third point is. And they say, who sees us and who knows us? You're worried about making disciples of yourself. It's very clear. I don't have to add much commentary to that. I mean, you just read those words and you see and you understand. Stop trying to make disciples of ourselves or our churches and direct people to Christ. That's the point. If you want to overcome and you want to recognize how to overcome that portion of stuff, then just continue to push people in that direction of Christ. And number 4, what did we say number 4 was? The observance of his mitzvah, or the observance of tradition over commands. It's the most important. It's the middle central star. What is the 4th verse he says here? You turn things around. Just turn around, man. Turn from, take care, Mike, it's good to see you. Turn from what you think your ways are, what you think is the right way to go, and go with what God has given. In other words, the turning away from and the turning towards God, the turning away from things and then turning towards God is the act of repentance. Now, the word teshuva is not the word that's used here. I was actually surprised by that, and I was expecting to find that. But the word that's used is just another Hebrew word that means turn. It means literally, it actually means to literally turn, I believe, within a 90-degree emphasis, is I believe what he had in the one book that I was looking at. So it's literally to turn and to have faith in the opposite direction. Teshuva means a little bit more than that. It means to turn away from one thing and towards something else, and then have forward momentum in that direction. So that's why the word teshuva has a little bit more of the meaning for repentance. But this particular passage, he says, you turn things around. The 5th section says, shall the potter be considered as equal with the clay? Willingness to allow God. We're talking about willingness to change, right? Willingness to allow God to mold us by what he has already established. We should be prepared and expect to be changed in every worship experience we have with him. Again, we should be prepared to be changed. We should expect that in every time that we come into a new experience. Every time we are recognizing that something we're doing is a way to worship God, expect to be changed by that. Perhaps, pray that our environment is changed. The 6th one, that what is made should say of its maker, he did not make me. Think about how that fits in the realm of responsibility. Who is responsible for making you? You or God?
We worship because of the little I in the word faith. If you take F-A-T-H, it means nothing, right? Okay, if you put a little letter I in there, it becomes faith. We worship because we have the faith, which goes back to Hebrews 11:1-2 and James 2. I mean, and you've touched on it a little bit, but I don't think you really said it out loud, that people watch us because we are professing, I am a confessing Christian. And I had one day, many years ago, I was working in a bookstore, and I kept walking through the cafe and cleaning up the tables. And someone stopped me and said, you're a Christian, aren't you? I said, well, yes, I am. He said, and I asked him why. He said, because you're doing something you don't have to do. So by faith, through faith, we worship God. So in Hebrews 1 and 2 it says, the faith is believing something you do not see. In James 2 it says, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds, can faith save him? So for me, worshiping comes from faith. I did not decide to have faith. God blessed me with faith. I did not make a decision. God said, through my parents, I was taught my faith. So I don't know where I'm going with this. I just get it out.
Scripture says too that to every man a portion or a measure of faith has been given. But we do increase that faith to the utilization of it. So continuing to worship God, making an intentional decision, as what Carl was saying, is that with my faith and through my faith, I make an intentional decision to worship. When we do that, we're utilizing the tool. And every time we utilize the tool, we get better and better at using it, and we find more experience in life or opportunity to continue to use it. So yeah, our worship of God, I think for the most part, we've gone through everything here. I think you guys, get this. We have a responsibility to be a good steward of what God has given us. And we have to use wisdom discerningly. I mean, that is really the last 2 points. And our way of having interaction with God is really dependent on the intentional effort that we put forth to do it. And really, that's one of the things that all of these 7 things that we talked about, one of the things that they all have in common is that you can be intentional with each one of them. You can choose to put them first, and you can choose to be that way and have your interaction with God, and more importantly, even with other people. God enjoys us having interaction with Him, but I think it is, on some levels, more important to Him that we have interaction with one another that is holy, an interaction that is full of wisdom, that is full of glory for Him. He could receive glory from the angels singing, or from His creation, who groans in eager expectation or sings His praises all day long. But from us, He wants us to live with peace. He wants us to be in communion and fellowship with one another.
And in recovery step work, this is steps 2 and 3.
One thing I was thinking about, brokenness prompts brokenness. And God's the truth and the light and all. And that's the truth, is that we were broken and had to surrender to God. And when we can share that with people and be sincere about it and genuine, therein lies the way that God can use us to bring other people to His love and power and way of life that's without all that other stuff.
Yeah. Well put, yeah. Anybody else got any comments or anything else? I don't know if I didn't make you guys feel like I rushed it all anyway to get through any of this stuff, but there's a lot coming out of me, and I really wanted to make sure that you at least understand that you have that last page. I am going to be continuing to read through and develop some of those ideas for myself, and trying to figure out where to change and how to be a little bit more intentional about, my interaction with people and with, worshiping God and just thinking about what He's done in my life.
I like the excitement and energy I was feeling coming off that day.
It's contagious. It's God's Spirit.
All right, well, you guys, I'm going to turn this video off. We're almost at an hour and a half.